Families shape women's and men's lives in all societies. And for many people, the ideal family is depicted in that iconic 1950s image of a male breadwinning husband wearing a suit and a wife at home taking care of the house and the children. But things began to change in the late 1960s. Many wives re-entered or remained in employment throughout their lives, and a growing number of women began to have children outside of marriage altogether. These trends are well documented in the literature, but research being conducted here in the Department of Social and Policy Sciences at the University of Bath has uncovered some new trends that fundamentally challenge the stability we thought was depicted in that iconic 1950s image.
Between the late 1960s and the late 1990s, overall employment levels in the economy were broadly the same. 75% of the working age population were in work. However, over the same period, there had been a profound move towards no-earner households and dual-earner households, that work had become polarized at the family level. And such this was sufficiently marked that we had around 1 in 5 households with nobody in work, some 3 times as many as would have been the case in the 1960s. So exploring what was sort of lying behind this big social change in the distribution of work across families, 3 sort of findings emerged. The first was that there were simply more families. People were partnering later, divorcing more, separating, and spending more time living as single adults. And that this, therefore, is more families. For the same level of work, you're going to end up with more workless families. More important, though, was that there was a shift in the employment pattern away from less educated men, particularly older men, and towards prime age mothers, typically with younger children, again, generally better educated. But the key point is that they were in different families, so that we had more dual-earner families tending to be better educated and more no-earner families generally focused on the less educated. Increasingly made up of 2 populations. It is workless families, particularly workless lone parents. But on the other side, we have the single earner male breadwinner model, where it still exists, in shrunken numbers, but it still exists, where that wage is no longer sufficiently enough, particularly amongst the less educated, to support the family and keep it out of poverty. This seemed to be strongly associated with the UK's welfare model at that time, which was heavily means tested, which meant that you could only receive welfare if you were living in a workless family, and rapidly withdrawn when you moved into work, particularly where that work was relatively low paid, which meant that work incentives were weak. The policy response was to use tax credits to make work pay, such that if you're taking a low wage job, the income was supplemented by extra tax rebates to the family. In addition, particularly for lone parents, there was a strong emphasis on also reducing childcare costs by subsidising childcare to try and make work attractive to families with children who would otherwise be workless. This polarisation of work into dual-earner and no-earner families was far from universal across countries. Now, in countries with welfare systems similar to the UK, Australia, Ireland, Belgium, we saw similar levels of this work pulling apart into no-earner and dual-earner families. But in southern European countries, the male breadwinner primary earner model remained firmly intact right through until the recent recession.
The Southern European male breadwinner model is very different from the ones that we see in the Northern Europe and also in the United States. The male breadwinner model in the South was basically centered around the male breadwinner, the husband, who usually had a very secure job and protected job in the formal labor market. And inside the family unit, there were very dense relationships of solidarity. There were also relationships of reciprocity and solidarity with the extended family as well. So that was creating, if you like, an alternative welfare system. Sometimes we call that a familistic welfare regime. There were streams of income from other kind of activities, a little bit of self-employment, There were sometimes small family businesses that other members of the family could find employment. There were favors exchanged between other members of the extended family. Sometimes there were political favors as well. And in that respect, the family itself was operating like a collective. It wasn't the kind of nuclear family that we understand in the Western Europe. Now, what happened in the last 20, 30 years, this traditional model of the Southern European kind of welfare arrangement started to change. Women entered the labor market. Families started taking more risky strategies when it came to financial affairs. And the model of the male breadwinner started changing into a dual earner model. After the entry of these countries into the Eurozone architecture, what has happened is that the families started buying, if you like, into a consumerist dream. They started exposing themselves a lot into private debt as well. And that has created a situation where, as the crisis hit these countries, the families did not have the resources to cope, if you like, successfully with the effects of the crisis. The sovereign debt crisis hits hard the core of the familistic welfare regimes in the Southern Europe. The removal of employment protection, the increasing taxation on small property, the fact that unemployment is increasing rapidly and jobs are not available means that the model cannot function anymore. So families finding it very, very hard to cope now with the crisis. In Southern Europe, the welfare state was the family. And it is ironic now that with the crisis, the government and the state is actually undermining the very foundations of the familistic model. So what's at stake here is social cohesion, and we expect to have a rapid rise in poverty and polarization.
Dual earner couples now outnumber male breadwinner couples in most affluent societies. Yet social science theory still holds that male breadwinner families are the most stable. And the evidence into the 1990s would seem to support this conjecture, in that couples where the wife was employed were statistically significantly more likely to divorce than couples where she was out of the labor force. So, does this evidence mean that the steady growth in the number of dual earner families is ringing the death knell for stable families? To answer this question, I convened a research network with colleagues in 10 other countries. We call ourselves the Gender Equality in Relationship Transitions Network, or GERT for short. Now, our basic premise is that we think the aggregate level of gender employment equality is going to be affecting the individual divorce risk faced by any given employed wife. This aggregate level of gender employment equality is in turn shaped by a variety of cultural and socio-political factors. At one end of the equality continuum, we've got the Mediterranean countries, where the familistic model in fact depends on that male breadwinner. And at the other end of the continuum, we've got the Nordic model. The Nordic welfare states have policies such as public provision of full-time childcare that allows more women to remain employed throughout their lives. And other policies, such as generous paid parental leave, encourage fathers to participate fully in the care work of the family. In between are the rest of Northern Europe and the Anglo countries. For example, in the United States, wives are generally likely to work full-time, but there's absolutely no policy support for doing so. And in countries such as Australia, Germany, and the UK, policies in fact encourage wives to work part-time to balance work and family. So with funding from the Leverhulme Trust, members of the GERT network harmonized the best available national data for exploring the relationship between wives' employment and divorce risk in the new millennium. What we found was that only in Italy and the United States, those two countries with the least policy support for working wives, was an employed wife still significantly more likely to divorce. In Australia, Flanders, France, the Netherlands, Germany, the United Kingdom, employed wives were not significantly more likely to divorce. In the Nordic countries of Finland, Norway, and Sweden, employed wives are now significantly less likely to divorce than wives who stay out of the labor force. Our research clearly shows that the male breadwinner model is not necessarily the most stable model anymore for modern societies, but at the same time, the evidence does not suggest that we're going to be seeing a decrease in the number of single-parent households.
The rising incidence of lone parent families is one of the most significant social changes to have taken place in the last 30 years. Today, 1 in 4 children are living with a lone parent, and that compares with just fewer than 1 in 20 in the 1970s. Up to half of all children will spend at least some time with a lone parent family, because lone parenthood is typically a transitory state. So lone parenthood today can be considered very much a normal part of family life. Lone parent families, while now very common, are also associated with a number of economic and social problems. In particular, lone parent families are more likely than others to be workless, they're more likely to be poor, and their children are widely perceived to do less well than those from families that are intact. Most recently, policy has suggested that we should be concerned about lone parenthood because of the high levels of welfare dependence and because the outcomes for children, in particular in relation to antisocial behaviour, are poor. But much of the evidence on which policy is based uses old data. Our research, which has looked at lone parents since the 1990s, has suggested that even over the relatively short period of a decade, things have been changing for lone parents. Today, lone parents are much more likely to work than they were prior to 1999, when there were major reforms to the welfare system. And lone parents are happier too. For those in work, rates of depression have fallen enormously, and children in lone parent families are doing better too. Policy has had a significant role in moving lone parents into work. Policy has increasingly activated the workforce, and there are increasing conditions placed on non-working lone parents. We think that policymakers need to recognise that the evidence on which they're currently basing policy is now out of date. We've recently received funding from the Economic and Social Research Council to look at lone parent families and at how what it means to be a lone parent has changed over the last 30 years. We know that the diversity in the experience of lone parenthood is likely to have increased, and we also know that inequalities between lone parent families are also likely to be growing. Lone parenthood, in particular, we know to be a transitory state. So for some lone parents, lone parenthood may be a short phase before moving into longer-term relationships. For other lone parents, it may be a more permanent state, while for others, there may be multiple partnership transitions. So lone parenthood today, it's common. Lone parents are not a homogeneous mass. Instead, their experiences are very different. Some lone parents are doing very well, whilst for others, the experience is less positive. And policy needs to adapt to think about how best to support these lone parents during this life stage.
Families are changing, with as much diversity in family forms to be found within and across countries. But one thing all families grapple with is the challenge of balancing production and reproduction. And what our research has shown is that policy should not try to reinvent that 1950s family. If instead policies support women and men in employment as well as family work, more families can not only survive, but thrive.